Hi everyone, welcome back. So in working with data from Brazilian Portuguese, we had just established the relationships between the vowels in the language, and we had seen that we need to assume two processes of vowel raising in the language, namely a process whereby non-low vowels become high tense vowels when unstressed, and whereby the low vowel a becomes a schwa when unstressed. We're now going to conduct a similar, well, before we move on there, I'd like you to note one thing here, which is that an interesting fact, which we'll keep in mind and which we'll return to shortly, is that the low vowel raising rule creates a schwa, and schwa will have the feature minus low. It's a non-low vowel. And this would be, non-low vowels are precisely the target of mid-vowel raising. So keep this fact in mind as we start looking at some further data, but we will return to discuss this point in greater detail. Okay, in the next group of data, we're going to concentrate on the phones ta, cha, da, and ja, and similarly establish what the phonemic and allophonic relationships are between these sounds. Since you might already guess what happens here. Here we aren't looking at any morphological structure, but we're just going to establish where these sounds occur based on static forms, so cases where we don't have morphologically conditioned alternations. Okay, and as I look through the data here, I see an affricate ja occurring before a vowel e and an affricate cha occurring before a vowel e. I think I'll start by just looking for all affricates in the data. Once again, an affricate occurring before e. Here we see an affricate before the vowel e. In 7, contigo, an affricate before the vowel e. In 9, an affricate before the vowel e. In the word dentes, teeth, an affricate occurs before the vowel e. In 15, the affricate also occurs before the vowel e. Usando, no affricate there. Gicidio, we have two affricates, two voiced palato-alveolar affricates, both before the vowel e. In volante, driving, we have an affricate before the vowel e as well. You probably have an idea already of what is happening. And similarly, in the remaining forms, when there's an affricate, it's always before the vowel e. So we can see here that the affricates, the two palato-alveolar affricates, cha and ja, only occur in the environment immediately preceding the high front vowel e. And in contrast, I won't look at this systematically. You can check here yourself, looking carefully through the data. It's the case that the two consonants, the corresponding alveolar stops, ta and da, I think in Brazilian Portuguese, they might actually be dentals, but that's not so important. These never occur before the vowel e. So just as we've seen in a number of other languages, we are dealing with some kind of process of palatalization. The affricates cha and ja must be considered allophones of the stops ta and da. Stops ta and da occur in the elsewhere environments. And so we'll set up a rule that we'll call palatalization. In Brazilian Portuguese, we can build a natural class consisting of the stops ta and da as the only stops, that is sounds with the feature specification minus delayed release, which are plus coronal. And in order to become affricates, they become plus delayed release. And actually, we technically need another feature change here too. If these are alveolars, just to remind you, I forgot to include this in my rule here, but it's not so important. We know what we mean. Assuming that if these are alveolars, remember alveolars and palato-alveolars are differentiated through different specifications of the features and anterior and distributed. The alveolars are plus anterior and minus distributed, whereas the palato-alveolars have reverse settings. So actually, to be a bit more correct for the palatalization rule, not only do those stops need to become plus delayed release, but they also need to become minus anterior and plus distributed. Okay, so thus far, we can, thus far, based on the three rules that we've established, mid-vowel raising, low vowel raising, and palatalization, we can say that all three of these are simply allophonic rules. But some of these rules, I alluded to this fact, I pointed out this fact earlier, some of these allophones are are identical with underlying phonemes. It's not always possible to simply replace surface sounds with different underlying sounds. So for instance, there are instances of surface E and U that reflect underlying E and U, right? So in words such as in roots, meaning chic and souk, for instance, there we need to assume that there's an underlying E and U. We can't simply, we would not want to, and we would obtain incorrect results if we said, there is an U here, it needs to be replaced with an O, for instance, because some U's on the surface have an underlying O, which is the case in row 7 of the first group of sounds here, where we see that alternation between O and U. So deciding whether a root or some morpheme contains an underlying E or an underlying U or an underlying mid-vowel depends upon the patterns of alternation. When there is no alternation, the E or U must be underlying. When there's alternation with the mid-vowel is underlying. And on the other hand, since the vowel schwa occurs exclusively in unstressed syllables, we can assume in the language that the sound schwa is not phonemic. Notice here I didn't include schwa in our phoneme inventory, and that instead schwa is merely an allophone of the underlying vowel. I'll try to draw this again somewhat better now. There's the underlying vowel and it has two allophones, and schwa. But schwa does not ever correspond to an underlying schwa. There is no underlying schwa. Okay. All right. Now, let's come to the problem that I mentioned a little earlier when we try to think about ways in which the rules that we have, the rules that we've posited could potentially interact. And in order to establish cases where rules might interact, we want to see instances where either two rules have some of the same possible targets, or where a rule affects some sounds that occur in the environment of another rule. Now, we can see above that we have a rule that creates instances of E, of the vowel E, and there's a rule that has the vowel E in its environment. So namely palatalization, the palatalization rule depends on the vowel E, and the mid-vowel raising rule can create instances of E. Specifically, if we have in a form, take what would be the underlying form for the word, let's choose another. the underlying form for the word shikeza. Sorry, I wanted no, sikura. There, the word sikura must have the vowel A in its underlying form. Based on our phonemic analysis, this must be the underlying form for the noun meaning dryness. And by mid-vowel raising and low-vowel raising, mid-vowel raising, and let's put the stress in the right place as well. By mid-vowel raising, we obtain sikeza, and by low-vowel raising, we obtain then the schwa that occurs in the, let's keep the stresses in the proper place, we obtain the schwa that occurs in the final syllable. The point here is when we see that palatalization contains an E and mid-vowel raising can create E's, we wanted to know whether, in fact, whether vowels, instances of the vowel E, which are created by the application of mid-vowel raising, give cases to which the palatalization rule can apply. In other words, we're asking ourselves whether or not mid-vowel raising feeds palatalization. So in order to investigate this question, let's look at the verbal root ard and forms that are built to this verbal root. Before we can do that, we need to add a few morphological rules. So there is a so-called thematic vowel, which is added in Portuguese if a verb belongs to the so-called second conjugation. So I'm going to invent a feature here, second conjugation. We won't worry more exactly in the morphology how this works. And in the infinitive, there's a suffix ra added. And in the third singular person non-past, there's simply no suffix added. So we'll see in third singular non-past forms a suffix a, and in infinitives of the second conjugation to which the root ard belongs, you'll see an additional r there. So the underlying forms for the infinitive and the third singular built to this root will be arder and arde. One further piece of information that we need is that you'll notice that from the pronunciation I just gave, the infinitive is ultimately has the stress a, and in non-finite forms there is this rule that we'll call stress shift. I'm not going to try to formalize this precisely, that places stress on the final syllable. So the infinitive will have stress. Let's add stress to the underlying forms, as it were, after the application of our stress shift rule. In the infinitive, the stress is going to fall here on this a, whereas in the third singular present, the stress is going to fall on the first syllable a. So there's something that happens in the infinitive that changes the position of the stress. We're not going to worry about the exact conditions for that, but because the rules that we are working with right now do depend upon stress, this rule is important. And I'm going to just assume that stress is assigned before any other rules. And this has to be the case clearly, since processes like mid-vowel raising and low-vowel raising depend upon stress, the position of the primary stress already having been established. All right, so let's think then about what would happen between, in terms of possible interactions between the processes of mid-vowel raising and palatalization in the infinitive and the third singular forms of this verb. So if we assume the ordering that mid-vowel raising, I'll move these underlying forms down here where we've added, to be explicit here, technically these are our underlying representations. let's have this stress shift rule. The stress shift rule will establish the position of the stress in our words. And then if we assume the ordering between mid-vowel raising and palatalization, then we will obtain the forms. Mid-vowel raising will raise this unstressed A to E, and we will have then an E in that second syllable. There will be no mid-vowel raising in the infinitive because the A vowel is in a stressed syllable. And now if palatalization attempts to apply afterwards, to apply second, now there is a possible target for palatalization in the third singular form of this verb. That is, it will become argi with the affricate G. And that actually is the correct form. That is actually the form that we want to have in Brazilian Portuguese. We want to have this affricate there in the third singular form. On the other hand, if we had the reverse order of these rules, namely if palatalization attempted to apply prior to mid-vowel raising, we would have a counter-feeding relationship. So here, if palatalization attempts to apply to the input arde, it is unable to apply because there is no coronal stop preceding a vowel E. It's only standing before a vowel A. Then, later, mid-vowel raising will apply because there is an unstressed mid-vowel, and the result is ardi. But that is incorrect. The third singular form in Brazilian Portuguese of the verb, of the root ard, is not arde, but rather argi. So the first rule ordering relationship must be the correct one. And if you had been given this data, this information from the start, then you would be able to use that information, this alternation in different forms of the verb, meaning burn, then we could have used those to establish the correct rule ordering. And as I've just said, this rule ordering is a feeding order because, let's put the correct derivation up over here again. So ardi is derived by mid-vowel raising, and then by palatalization, we obtain argi. By palatalization, we obtain argi. So mid-vowel raising needed to apply first in order to create the conditions for the application for palatalization, right? If we had the opposite order and the third singular form had been arde rather than, sorry, that should be ardi. Yeah, actually, in both of these forms, there's a typo here. We should read ardi rather than, and right here we should read ardi, not arde. I'll correct those when I upload this handout. And let me write it on here just to be certain that it's clear. So the forms here should be arde, sorry, ardi, and also down here we have ardi. The vowel at the end should be an E. So, right. Now, if we had those forms without the affricate in the third singular, then it would be a case of a counterfeeding order, a case in which the rule that creates the conditions for the application of a later rule applies too late in order to create those necessary conditions. So it's always a bit trickier to see these instances of counterfeeding and counterbleeding because you don't actually see the effects of the rule. And let's think a little bit more about this form, about the infinitive arder. and the stress shift rule. Now, this rule, the stress shift rule, it actually destroys a target for mid-vowel raising. I should actually put in these underlying forms, stress on the initial syllable first. The stress shift really moves the stress from the initial syllable to the second syllable. And this stress shift rule, if it had not applied before mid-vowel raising, then it would have allowed for mid-vowel raising to apply in the infinitive, and we would obtain argir, or argir rather, instead. But the real order is a bleeding order, because if stress shift applies first, stress shift removes a target for mid-vowel raising. So because in the underlying representation of the infinitive, this A is unstressed, but then this rule moves the stress here. Then we get then we now have an A in a stressed syllable, and mid-vowel raising is no longer able to apply. And if the case, in the case where we had an infinitive argir, there should be an erotic at the end of all of these forms. In this case, we should read argir in both of these cases, not argi, since the stress shift only is relevant for the infinitive forms. In a language in which we actually had the infinitive form argir, let's read infinitive here rather than third singular, we would have a case of a counter bleeding order. Let's illustrate that quickly with one more derivation. So make explicit what happens if we had a counter bleeding relationship between the stress shift and mid-vowel raising. So if mid-vowel raising applied first, then both the infinitive and the third singular would have a vowel E in the second syllable. The stress shift process only applies to the infinitive and would move the stress here onto the second syllable. And now palatalization would also be able to apply in the infinitive form and not just in the third singular form of this verb. Let's make sure the stress is in the correct place. The infinitive in that case would be the non-existent form argir with an E. That would make it, if we had this interaction between stress shift and mid-vowel raising, this would be a considerably more complicated language to understand, because we would also have cases of vowels on the surface that are stressed, but which have undergone a process which depends upon them being stressless. That would be very confusing, in fact. Luckily, that is not actually how the language works. Okay, at this point, let's take another small break before we continue on to see some further examples of how our Brazilian Portuguese rules interact with one another.